November 17th, 1928, Chicago, Illinois. That morning, the city woke up cold and gray. A sharp wind blew through South Michigan Avenue, cutting between tall buildings like a knife. Inside the Lexington Hotel, one of the most guarded places in America, Al Capone was already awake. The Lexington was not just a hotel. It was Capone's headquarters, his office, his fortress. Every employee worked for him. Every hallway was watched. Every room could turn into a trap or an escape route within seconds. If Capone wanted someone dead inside this building, that person would never make it outside. Al Capone was 29 years old and at the peak of his power. His bootlegging empire made more than $100 million a year. His name terrified Chicago. His enemies were either dead, hiding, or paying him. He had survived assassination attempts, bomb attacks, and endless gang wars. By 1928, most people believed Al Capone was untouchable. But that morning, Capone was waiting for a meeting that should not have happened. A meeting that broke every rule of the criminal underworld. A meeting that crossed racial lines no one dared to cross. A meeting that would stay secret for decades. Capone sat in a private dining room on the 4th floor. The table was covered with expensive Italian food, fresh bread, wine, and cigars. Two men sat nearby. Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik, his money man, the one who handled politicians and police, and Frank Nitti, his enforcer, the man who solved problems with violence. Capone looked calm, but his mind was working. For months, he had faced a problem violence could not fix: Harlem. Harlem's numbers racket was making millions. Black gamblers ran it with discipline and loyalty the Italians couldn't break. White gangsters like Dutch Schultz had tried to take it by force. They spent tens of thousands every month on guns, bribes, and killers, and still Harlem refused to fall. The war was expensive, the violence brought police attention, and the profits were not coming. Someone had suggested a solution so strange that Capone laughed when he first heard it. Make a deal with a black gangster. Capone thought it was insane, and yet here he was. At 9:47 a.m., Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked into the Lexington Hotel. He was only 23 years old, a black man, in Chicago, in Al Capone's building. That alone could get a man killed. Bumpy Johnson had arrived 3 days earlier from New York. He had been sent by Stephanie St. Clair, the powerful woman who ruled Harlem's numbers game. She was under pressure. White mobs wanted her territory. Harlem was bleeding. Bumpy carried a message that could save Harlem or get him murdered. He was searched twice before entering. No weapons, no tricks, just a sharp mind, a calm face, and the confidence of someone who understood risk. 2 Italian bodyguards escorted him upstairs in silence. When Bumpy entered the dining room, the air changed. Capone stood up. "Mr. Johnson," Capone said, extending his hand. That alone shocked the room. In 1928, most white men would not shake hands with a black man, but Capone did. "Welcome to Chicago. Sit, eat. Business goes better on a full stomach." Bumpy sat carefully, respectful but not weak, calm but alert. "Mr. Capone," Bumpy said, "Madame St. Clair sends her respects. She asked me to bring you a proposal that could benefit both sides." Capone poured wine. "I'm listening, but understand this. You're asking me to deal with black gangsters, to respect their territory, to stop white men from taking Harlem. Yes, sir, I know exactly what I'm asking. Capone smiled slightly. You're asking me to deal with black gangsters, to respect their territory, to stop white men from taking Harlem. Yes, Bumpy said, because fighting over Harlem is costing you more than it's worth. The room went silent. Frank Nitti stared at Bumpy. Guzik stopped flipping through papers. No one talked to Al Capone like that. Capone leaned forward. You think I can't take Harlem if I want it? I think you can, Bumpy said calmly, but I think winning would cost you more money than you'd ever make from it. That was the moment. Capone stared at Bumpy for several seconds, then laughed. I like you, Capone said. You've got guts. Bumpy reached into his jacket and slowly placed papers on the table. These are numbers, he said. Dutch Schultz and others are spending about $50,000 a month trying to take Harlem. 6 months in, they don't control it. They're losing men, drawing attention, and making nothing. Guzik read the pages carefully. He's right, Guzik said. The math checks out. Bumpy continued. Harlem's numbers game makes about $20 million a year, clean profit. What if you gave you 15% every year for doing nothing but keeping white mobs out? Capone leaned back. How much is that? $3 million, Bumpy said. Minimum. $3 million. No violence, no risk. Capone tapped the table slowly. And what do you want in return? Autonomy, Bumpy said. Harlem stays black-run. We don't move into white areas. We pay tribute. You keep the peace. Capone stood and walked to the window. He looked out at Chicago. You know what you're really asking, he said quietly. You're asking me to change how the underworld works. Yes, Bumpy said, because the old way is bleeding money. Capone turned around. Then he said something no one expected. I was already thinking the same thing. The room froze. Capone walked back to the table. Prohibition won't last forever. Bootlegging will die. Gambling won't. And Harlem runs the smartest numbers game in America. He looked at Bumpy. So here's my counteroffer. Bumpy listened carefully. You pay 15%, not 20%. In return, Harlem teaches my people how your numbers system works, and you stay in Chicago as my liaison. Bumpy's heart raced. This wasn't protection. This was partnership, and it would change everything. November 17th, 1928, did not end with handshakes or smiles. It ended with silence, calculation, and risk. After Al Capone finished speaking, the room stayed quiet for several seconds. The weight of what had just been offered settled on everyone sitting at that table. This was not a normal protection deal. This was not simple tribute. This was a complete shift in how American organized crime could function. Bumpy Johnson understood that accepting this offer would change his life forever. If he said yes, he would not just be a Harlem numbers man anymore. He would become a bridge between two worlds that were never meant to touch. A black gangster working directly with the most powerful white gangster in America. That kind of role came with power, but also danger from every direction. Bumpy spoke carefully. Mr. Capone, he said, this decision is bigger than me. I was sent here by Madame St. Clair. I need to speak to her before I agree to anything." Capone nodded. "That's fair," he said. "You'll have privacy. Call her. But understand this. This offer stands for 1 week. After that, I let the war continue, and Harlem will bleed." Bumpy was given a private room with a telephone. Guards waited outside. The call to Harlem took several minutes to connect. When Stephanie St. Clair's voice finally came through the line, Bumpy spoke slowly and clearly. He explained everything: Capone's offer, the reduced tribute, the autonomy, the knowledge sharing, the secrecy. St. Clair listened without interrupting. When Bumpy finished, there was a long pause. "You understand," she finally said, "that this means we stay alive, but it also means we accept the reality of power." "Yes," Bumpy replied, "but it keeps Harlem black run, and it stops the bloodshed." St. Clair exhaled. "Then accept it," she said, "because dead independence helps no one." When Bumpy returned to the dining room, Capone was already pouring another glass of wine. "She agreed?" Capone smiled. "Good, then let's build something smart." Over the next 2 days, details were worked out quietly. No paperwork, no signatures. Everything was based on trust, fear, and profit. The rules were simple. Black gangs would control black neighborhoods, numbers, gambling, small rackets. White gangs would stay out. In return, 15% of profits would be paid quarterly. Protection would be guaranteed. Police pressure would be managed. Wars would stop. Bumpy stayed in Chicago. Officially, he was just another associate. Unofficially, he became the key communicator between Capone's world and black operators across the country: Detroit, Baltimore, St. Louis, Cleveland. Messages passed through him. Disputes ended before they turned violent. Territory lines became respected. Money flowed. By early 1929, Harlem sent its first tribute payment. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. Clean, organized, reliable. Dutch Schultz backed off. Not because he wanted to, but because someone higher had spoken. Violence dropped almost overnight. Police raids slowed. Numbers operations expanded. Profits increased on both sides. Capone got steady income without blood. Black operators got stability they had never known. And Bumpy Johnson became untouchable. Not because he was the strongest man in the room, but because he was necessary. When Capone was arrested in 1931, the system didn't collapse. Frank Nitti took over in Chicago and kept the arrangement alive. Later, when Lucky Luciano formed the commission, parts of this structure quietly became standard practice. Territory, tribute, rules, dispute resolution. What started as a secret meeting became a blueprint. Bumpy eventually returned to Harlem, stronger than ever, protected, respected, feared. But also careful, because he knew something most men didn't. Power wasn't just about violence. It was about knowing when to make peace. And in a world built on blood, that knowledge made him dangerous in a different way. The deal made in 1928 stayed hidden for decades, not written in books, not spoken aloud. Protected by both sides because exposing it would anger everyone. White gangs didn't want to admit cooperation. Black gangs didn't want to admit subordination. So the truth stayed buried. But its effects shaped American crime for nearly 40 years. And all of it began with a young man walking into a hotel where he should never have been allowed to enter. By the early 1930s, The effects of the 1928 deal were impossible to ignore, even though almost no one openly talked about it. Harlem was quieter, not peaceful, but organized. The constant attacks from white mobs stopped. Numbers houses stayed open. Money moved smoothly. Police raids became predictable instead of random. Warnings came early. Arrests dropped. Profits grew. For the first time, black gambling operations were not just surviving, they were thriving. Bumpy Johnson returned to Harlem a different man. He was no longer just an enforcer or a numbers lieutenant. He was a man with backing, not street-level backing, but national backing. The kind that meant if someone touched him, questions would be asked in places most men never reached. People noticed. Rivals who once challenged him now avoided him. Arguments ended when his name was mentioned. Deals closed faster. Problems disappeared quietly. Not because Bumpy was loud, but because he didn't need to be. Behind the scenes, the system held. Every 3 months, tribute moved north, cash only, no records, always on time. In return, Harlem remained Harlem. No Italian bosses walking in, no takeover attempts, no wars. Other cities followed the model. Detroit's black numbers operators entered similar arrangements, so did Baltimore and Cleveland. Always the same structure: autonomy in exchange for a cut, protection instead of violence. When Lucky Luciano created the Commission in 1931, he didn't invent everything from scratch. Some ideas were already tested: territory rules, profit sharing, conflict resolution. The Capone-Johnson model quietly lived on inside the larger system. Al Capone went to prison, but his ideas survived him. Frank Nitti maintained the agreements. Later bosses respected them, not because they loved them, but because they worked. Money kept coming. Violence stayed low. Attention stayed away. Bumpy Johnson ruled Harlem for decades, not as a king, as a manager. He enforced order. He punished recklessness. He protected his people, not out of kindness, but because stability made money, and money kept everyone alive. The deal stayed secret. White bosses didn't want to admit they negotiated with black gangsters as equals in business. Black operators didn't want to admit they paid tribute. So history stayed quiet. Books skipped it. Movies ignored it. Newspapers never reported it. Only whispers remained. By the time civil rights changed America, the underworld was already changing too. Drugs replaced gambling. New gangs rose. Old rules faded. By the 1970s, the original agreement was gone, but its shadow remained. It proved something uncomfortable: that in segregated America, criminals found cooperation before society did, that profit could break barriers faster than politics, that power wasn't always about domination, but about negotiation. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, quietly, at a restaurant in Harlem. Al Capone died years earlier, broken by illness. But the deal they made in 1928 outlived them both. A secret understanding, a hidden alliance, a moment when two men saw past hatred and chose business. History doesn't like stories like this. They're messy. They don't fit clean morals. They challenge easy narratives. But they're real. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. Because sometimes the most powerful moves are the ones no one is ever supposed to know happened.